When Marcus Thompson sat alone at a cafe table at 7:42 p.m. on a Friday evening, his 5-year-old daughter Riley's glitter still visible in his close-cropped black hair from their afternoon craft project, where they had made construction paper butterflies, and she'd hugged him so tight that glitter had transferred from her small hands to his face and hair in a way that no amount of washing could completely remove. Watching his blind date, Vanessa, walk out the door of the modest neighborhood cafe after 15 brutal minutes of her looking at her phone with barely concealed disdain and making thinly veiled comments about men who can't afford real restaurants, as if the local cafe he'd chosen wasn't good enough for someone of her obvious sophistication, about single dads with baggage as if his beautiful daughter Riley was burden rather than blessing, about teachers' salaries as if dedicating his life to shaping young minds was somehow failure rather than calling, feeling humiliation burn through him in waves that made his dark brown skin feel hot and his chest tight and his eyes sting with tears. He refused to let fall in public because he was 33 years old and a father and a professional, and shouldn't be this devastated by rejection from someone he just met. This was his first attempt at dating since his wife Jordan had died 3 years ago in a car accident that had stolen her from him and from Riley, who'd been only 2 and didn't remember her mother beyond the photographs Marcus showed her every night and the stories he told about the woman who'd loved them both more than life itself. And he'd just been rejected before appetizers had even arrived, before he'd had chance to explain that, yes, he was a widower, and yes, he had a young daughter, and yes, his teacher's salary was modest, but that didn't make him less worthy of connection, less deserving of companionship, less valuable as human being and potential partner. He thought this confirmed what he'd feared during the 3 years since Jordan's death. During the countless nights when Riley had cried for her mommy and Marcus had held her while crying himself. During the moments when loneliness felt like physical weight pressing on his chest, and he'd wondered if anyone would ever want a man with a kindergartner and a modest income and grief he was still learning to carry like permanent companion. That being a widowed single father made him undateable in ways that no amount of kindness or dedication or love for his daughter could overcome. That no woman would want a man whose heart was still healing from losing the love of his life, whose schedule revolved entirely around a 5-year-old's needs, whose financial resources were stretched thin between rent and childcare, and the million small expenses that came with raising a child alone, whose conversation inevitably returned to his daughter because she was his entire world, and he couldn't separate being Riley's father from being Marcus the man. But it wasn't confirmation of his unworthiness, wasn't proof that Vanessa's cruel assessment was accurate, wasn't evidence that grief and single parenthood and modest means made him undeserving of love or connection or basic human kindness. It wasn't the end of hope for connection, even though hope felt like a dangerous thing to hold after being rejected so thoroughly, after being made to feel small and inadequate and less than by someone who judged him in 15 minutes and found him wanting. It wasn't a night that would end in loneliness, with Marcus driving home to his empty apartment where Mrs. R. Chen, the elderly neighbor, was babysitting Riley and would ask how the date went with eyes full of hope that Marcus wouldn't be able to meet, because explaining that he'd been rejected before appetizers felt like admitting defeat. Because Claire Morrison, the 34-year-old white woman with shoulder-length brown hair and kind blue eyes, sitting 2 tables away with her laptop open and coffee growing cold, who'd been trying to focus on the presentation she needed to finish for Monday's client meeting, but kept getting distracted by the painful scene unfolding in the nearby table, who'd watched the entire awful interaction from Vanessa's arrival to her cruel departure, who'd seen Vanessa's dismissive body language and heard her cutting comments about the cafe being beneath her standards, and seen Marcus's shoulders slump with each criticism, who'd witnessed Marcus's quiet dignity as he'd remained polite even while being eviscerated, walked over with her coffee mug in hand and heart pounding with the audacity of what she was about to do, and said with smile that was gentle and genuine and contained no pity, only kindness, "I hate eating alone. Mind if I join you?" The question rhetorical, because she was already pulling out the chair across from him, already sitting down, already meeting his eyes with expression that said she'd seen what happened and thought Vanessa was wrong about everything. And when Marcus looked up with dark brown eyes that expected more rejection, that had learned in 15 minutes to brace for cruelty disguised as honesty, that showed exhaustion and hurt and the particular vulnerability of someone who just had their worst fears about their own unworthiness confirmed by a stranger. What happened next would teach him that sometimes the worst moments in life create space for the best connections. That kindness comes from unexpected places and unexpected people who see your pain and choose to address it rather than ignore it. That the right person sees your worth when the wrong person can't. That being a devoted father and dedicated teacher and grieving widower wasn't baggage but evidence of a heart capable of profound love and commitment and strength. If you believe that real kindness means showing up when someone's been hurt, that compassion requires witnessing another person's pain and choosing to ease it rather than walk past it, that the most meaningful connections often begin with someone extending grace to a stranger who needs it desperately. Please like this video right now, share it with someone who needs this reminder that humanity still exists in small acts of courage, and comment below where you're watching from, because every like and share helps stories about compassion and unexpected kindness reach people who've lost faith in humanity, who've been hurt so many times they've stopped believing in the possibility of goodness, who need to know that sometimes strangers become the family you didn't know you needed. Marcus Thompson was 33 years old and an elementary school teacher at Lincoln Elementary, where he taught 4th grade, where his students drew him pictures and wrote him notes and occasionally told him he was their favorite teacher and voices that made the modest salary and long hours feel worthwhile, where he shaped young minds and tried to give his students the kind of patient attention and genuine care that he wanted Riley to receive from her teachers as she grew. He was a single father to 5-year-old Riley, who had her mother's smile and her father's determination and a laugh that could light up rooms, who loved butterflies and purple everything and making crafts with glitter that ended up everywhere, despite Marcus's best efforts at containment, who asked every night when she'd see mommy again, because she was too young to fully understand that mommy wasn't coming back from heaven, no matter how many times Marcus explained it, with tears streaming down his face. His wife Jordan had died 3 years ago in a car accident, a drunk driver running a red light and hitting her car with enough force to kill her instantly, leaving Marcus alone with a 2-year-old who kept asking for her mother, and a grief so profound it felt like drowning. Like learning to breathe underwater, like existing in a world that had lost all color and warmth and meaning beyond the small person who needed him to keep functioning. He hadn't dated since Jordan's death, hadn't even considered it because dating felt like betrayal, like admitting she was really gone, like trying to replace someone irreplaceable. And because the thought of explaining to someone new that he was a widower with a young daughter and a teacher's salary that barely covered expenses felt exhausting before he even began. His friend David had convinced him to try this blind date after months of gentle pressure, after countless conversations about how Jordan would want Marcus to be happy, how Riley needed to see her father living and not just surviving, how 3 years was long enough to grieve before allowing himself the possibility of connection again. David had set him up with Vanessa, Someone from his wife's book club, who was supposedly beautiful and successful and ready to settle down, had assured Marcus that Vanessa understood about his situation and wouldn't judge him for being a single father, or for his modest income, or for the grief he was still learning to carry. Marcus made a teacher's salary that felt inadequate every time he looked at his bank account, that required careful budgeting and secondhand clothes and saying no to Riley's requests for toys he couldn't afford. That meant choosing the modest neighborhood cafe for his first date because anything fancier would have required money he needed for Riley's new shoes and next month's childcare, and the million small expenses that came with raising a child alone. He was still grieving in ways he didn't talk about, still had moments when he forgot Jordan was gone and reached for his phone to call her, still cried in the shower where Riley couldn't hear him, still wore his wedding ring because taking it off felt like final acknowledgement that she wasn't coming back. He was still learning to parent alone, figuring out how to braid hair through YouTube tutorials and navigate conversation about why Riley didn't have a mommy like other kids, and balance being both mother and father to a child who needed more than one person could possibly provide. He was worried he was undateable in ways that felt confirmed by Vanessa's reaction, worried that being a widower made him too damaged for someone new to want, that having a 5-year-old daughter meant any potential partner would always be second priority, that his limited income meant he couldn't provide the lifestyle that successful women expected, that his grief and his devotion to Riley and his modest means added up to someone no woman would choose when she could have someone without complications. Vanessa had been the woman David's wife had set him up with, had arrived at the cafe 15 minutes late, wearing designer clothes and expensive jewelry that immediately made Marcus feel underdressed in his best khakis and button-down shirt from Target, had looked around the modest cafe with barely concealed disappointment as if she'd expected somewhere with white tablecloths and wine lists instead of laminated menus and self-service coffee. She was materialistic in ways that became immediately apparent, judged the cafe and Marcus's choice of venue, and probably Marcus himself in the first 30 seconds. Made comments about successful people knowing how to choose appropriate restaurants that made Marcus's face burn with shame because this cafe was what he could afford, and he'd thought it was nice enough for a first date. She looked down on teachers' salaries with the contempt of someone who measured worth in income, had asked what he did, and when he'd said elementary school teacher had actually wrinkled her nose like he'd admitted to something distasteful, had said that teaching was noble but not exactly lucrative, with emphasis that made clear she didn't find nobility impressive if it came with modest paycheck. She'd made comments about baggage when he'd mentioned having a daughter, had called Riley his baggage in a tone that was supposedly joking, but carried real judgment, had said that single dads came with complications that most women weren't interested in dealing with, had spent most of the 15 minutes looking at her phone and making it clear through body language that she was already planning her exit. She'd left after 15 minutes, had stood up while Marcus was mid-sentence about Riley's upcoming kindergarten graduation, and said she just remembered she had an early morning tomorrow and this clearly wasn't going to work out, had walked out without offering to split the coffee bill or pretending she'd call or even basic courtesy of wishing him well, had left him sitting alone at a table set for two with humiliation burning through him and the certainty that David's wife would hear all about how Marcus was too poor and too damaged and too encumbered with a child to be worth anyone's time. She'd humiliated Marcus publicly in a cafe where other people had definitely witnessed the brief, disastrous date, where he'd have to sit alone processing rejection while strangers who'd watched Vanessa leave probably pitied him or agreed with her assessment that he wasn't worth 15 minutes of anyone's time. Claire Morrison had been sitting 2 tables away, was 34 years old, and recently divorced after her husband of 8 years had decided that her corporate consulting career that required frequent travel was less important than his need for a wife who stayed home, had left her 6 months ago for his secretary, who apparently understood that a man's career should be prioritized over a woman's. She was a corporate consultant who traveled frequently for work, who was good at her job and made excellent money, but had learned that professional success didn't prevent personal failure. Who was in the cafe alone on a Friday evening because she had a presentation to finish, and an empty apartment that felt lonely, and a growing understanding that being divorced at 34 with no children and no desire to change her career meant she'd probably be alone for a long time. She'd been at the cafe working or trying to work while actually scrolling through her phone and procrastinating because the presentation felt less important than the loneliness that had been her constant companion since the divorce. She'd witnessed the entire awful date from her nearby table, had heard Vanessa's cutting comments, and seen Marcus's shoulder slump, and watched him try to maintain dignity while being systematically demolished by someone who judged him in minutes and found him wanting. She couldn't stand watching Marcus be hurt, couldn't sit there and do nothing while a good man was being treated cruelly for circumstances beyond his control, couldn't ignore the voice in her head that said someone needed to show him that not everyone was as terrible as the woman who just walked out. She'd acted on impulse to help, had closed her laptop and picked up her coffee mug and walked over to his table before she could talk herself out of it. Before fear of rejection or social awkwardness or the possibility that he'd think she was crazy could stop her from doing what felt like the right thing, even if it was unconventional. Marcus's first date since his wife died had lasted 15 minutes and ended with him alone at a cafe table, with glitter in his hair and humiliation in his chest, and the certainty that he'd been right to avoid dating because this was exactly the kind of pain he'd been protecting himself from. His friend had set him up with Vanessa thinking she'd be perfect, not understanding that perfect for David's wife's book club friend wasn't the same as perfect for a widowed teacher with a kindergartner and a heart still healing from loss. The date had been at the modest cafe Marcus had chosen because it was all he could afford, had thought was nice enough with its comfortable chairs and good coffee and casual atmosphere, hadn't realized that someone like Vanessa would see modest as inadequate and casual as failure. Vanessa had insulted the venue and his job and his situation with the precision of someone practiced at finding weaknesses, had made him feel small and poor and inadequate in 15 minutes, had left him sitting alone and humiliated with other customers, definitely aware that he'd been rejected before the date had really begun. Claire had been watching from a nearby table, had seen everything, had felt anger on Marcus's behalf rise with each of Vanessa's cruel comments, and had made the decision to walk over and insert herself into a stranger's pain. Because sometimes doing the right thing meant being uncomfortable, meant taking a risk, meant showing up for someone who desperately needed to know that not everyone in the world was cruel. Have you ever watched someone being hurt and felt compelled to intervene, even knowing they were a stranger and you had no obligation beyond basic human decency? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. At 7:45 p.m., 3 minutes after Vanessa had walked out and left Marcus sitting alone with humiliation burning through him like fever, Claire Morrison approached his table, carrying her coffee mug in hands that trembled slightly with the nervousness of what she was about to do. This beautiful stranger with kind blue eyes and gentle smile walking toward him when he'd just been rejected and was bracing for more rejection, because that seemed to be the theme of the evening. Marcus looked up at her approach with shock written across his face, his dark brown eyes wide with confusion and wariness, expecting more rejection because why would a beautiful woman approach him now? After she'd witnessed his humiliation, after she'd seen him be deemed unworthy by someone who'd spent 15 minutes cataloging his inadequacies. "I saw what happened," Claire said as she reached his table, her voice gentle but firm, carrying anger that wasn't directed at Marcus, but at the woman who just left. "She was cruel, incredibly cruel, and nobody deserves to be treated the way she treated you. Nobody deserves to be judged and found wanting in 15 minutes. Nobody deserved to have their circumstances used as weapons against them." Marcus felt his face grow hot with embarrassment because having his humiliation witnessed made it worse somehow, made it real in a way that it hadn't been when it was just him and Vanessa, made him want to disappear or defend himself or explain that he wasn't really as inadequate as Vanessa had made him seem. "I hate eating alone," Claire continued, already pulling out the chair across from him before he could refuse or make excuses or tell her that he was fine and didn't need pity from a stranger. "Mind if I join you?" The question, not really a question because she was already sitting down, already placing her coffee mug on the table, already settling into the seat that Vanessa had vacated 3 minutes ago. "I'm Claire," she said, extending her hand across the table with a smile that seemed genuine. And that woman was an idiot, an absolute idiot who wouldn't know a good man if he was sitting right in front of her, buying her coffee and being patient with her cruelty. Marcus's mind was processing the situation with the systematic assessment he usually reserved for lesson planning or evaluating whether Riley's fever required a doctor or could be managed at home, cataloging facts that didn't quite add up to anything that made sense. She witnessed his humiliation, had seen the entire painful interaction from beginning to end, had heard Vanessa's comments about teacher salaries and single dad baggage in restaurants that weren't good enough, had watched him try to maintain dignity while being systematically demolished. She was beautiful in ways that made him wonder why she was sitting here with him, had the kind of professional polish that suggested success and confidence, and the ability to choose better company than a recently rejected teacher with glitter in his hair. She seemed genuinely kind, not performing kindness for show, but actually warm, her smile reaching her eyes in ways that suggested she meant what she was saying, her posture open and relaxed despite approaching a stranger. This felt like pity, though, felt like she'd seen him be rejected and felt sorry for him and was offering charity in the form of her company. And he didn't want pity because pity made him feel smaller than Vanessa's rejection had. Made him feel like someone who needed rescuing rather than someone who was capable and strong and just having a terrible night. He didn't want pity from this beautiful stranger who probably felt obligated to be kind because she'd witnessed his humiliation and her conscience wouldn't let her ignore it. But she was already sitting, had made the decision for both of them by taking the seat before he could refuse, was looking at him with expectation that suggested she actually wanted to be here rather than feeling obligated. Her smile seemed real, not the pitying smile he'd expected, but genuine warmth, the kind of smile that suggested she saw him as person worth knowing rather than charity case worth helping. Maybe he should give this a chance, should accept this unexpected kindness, even if he didn't fully understand it. Should let someone be nice to him after an evening of cruelty, because maybe not everyone was like Vanessa. Maybe not everyone would judge him for circumstances beyond his control. At 7:50 p.m., 5 minutes after Claire had sat down at his table, uninvited but not unwelcome, she asked the question that surprised Marcus more than her approach had. "Tell me about your daughter," she said, leaning forward with genuine interest. "The glitter in your hair suggests either a craft project with a 5-year-old or a very interesting night out. And I'm guessing based on the time and the fact that you're here alone, it's the former." Marcus was surprised she was asking about Riley, that her first question was about his daughter rather than about what had just happened or why he was alone or any of the questions he'd expected from someone who'd witnessed his rejection. Craft project, Marcus confirmed, relaxing slightly because talking about Riley always made him relax, always reminded him of what mattered beyond dating disasters and financial struggles and the opinions of people like Vanessa. We made butterflies this afternoon, construction paper and glitter and pipe cleaners, and she insisted on giving me a hug while her hands were still covered in glitter. So now I'm wearing evidence of our afternoon everywhere. His smile as he talked about Riley was the first genuine smile of the evening, transformed his face from tired and hurt to warm and loving, showed Claire exactly who he was beneath the humiliation. Riley is 5, Marcus continued, finding himself opening up to the stranger in ways he hadn't expected. She starts kindergarten in the fall and she's excited and terrified in equal measure, loves butterflies and purple everything, and asking why about literally everything. My wife Jordan died 3 years ago in a car accident, so it's been just Riley and me figuring out life together, learning to be a family of 2 instead of 3. I'm a 4th grade teacher at Lincoln Elementary, spend my days with 9-year-olds who think I know everything, and my evenings with a 5-year-old who knows I don't know everything, but loves me anyway. This was my first date since Jordan died, Marcus added with self-deprecating humor that didn't quite hide the hurt, clearly went well, made it past the 15-minute mark, but just barely, learning that being a widowed single father with a teacher's salary makes me undateable according to Vanessa's assessment. Claire felt anger flash through her again at how Marcus had been treated, at how someone had taken his vulnerability and used it against him, at how circumstances that showed his strength and character had been reframed as inadequacies. I'm recently divorced, Claire shared, deciding that matching vulnerability for vulnerability was the right approach. My ex-husband cheated on me with his secretary after 8 years of marriage, said my career was emasculating him, said I traveled too much and made too much money, and made him feel inadequate. So I understand bad dates, she added with wry smile, though mine lasted 8 years instead of 15 minutes. So you're actually ahead of me in terms of efficiency in identifying people who aren't worth your time. They laughed together then, genuine laughter that released some of the tension Marcus had been carrying, that acknowledged the absurdity and pain of failed relationships. At 8 p.m., 15 minutes into a conversation that had started as rescue mission and had become genuine connection, they were talking about loss and loneliness and starting over with the kind of honesty that usually took months to develop, but somehow felt natural in this moment. They talked about loss, about how Marcus had lost his wife in an instant and was still learning 3 years later how to be both mother and father to Riley, how he still wore his wedding ring because taking it off felt like betrayal, how he still cried in the shower where Riley couldn't hear him, how grief was something he carried every day but had learned to carry while still functioning and parenting and teaching and living. Claire talked about losing her marriage in slow motion, about watching her husband grow resentful of her success, about the moment she'd discovered the affair and realized she'd been competing with his secretary for his attention while trying to build her career, about how divorce felt like failure even when staying would have felt worse. They talked about single parenting, about how Marcus's entire life revolved around Riley's schedule and needs and the constant calculation of whether he was doing enough or failing her in ways he couldn't see, about how every decision was filtered through the question of what was best for his daughter, about how exhausting and rewarding and terrifying it was to be solely responsible for another human's well-being. They talked about starting over, about how both of them were scared of trying again after being hurt, about how dating felt like vulnerability, and vulnerability felt dangerous after trust had been broken, about how much easier it was to stay alone and safe than to risk being hurt again. They talked about what they wanted, admitting they were both unsure, both trying to figure out if they even had capacity for new relationships or if their damaged hearts needed more time to heal before attempting connection again. Marcus was realizing as they talked that Claire wasn't pitying him, wasn't treating him like charity case or damaged goods or someone who needed rescuing, was actually genuinely interested in his life, in his daughter, and his thoughts about teaching and parenting and grief. She asked about Riley constantly, wanted to know about her personality and her interests and her adjustment to being in a single-parent household, asked questions that showed she saw Riley as person rather than burden or baggage or complication. She didn't care about his salary, hadn't blinked when he'd mentioned being a teacher, hadn't wrinkled her nose or made comments about teachers not making enough money, had actually said that teaching was one of the most important professions and people who shaped young minds deserve more respect than they received. She was seeing him as person, Marcus realized, with something approaching wonder, not as widower with baggage or single dad with complications or poor teacher who couldn't afford nice restaurants, but as Marcus, who was a father and teacher and man still learning to live after loss, whose circumstances were part of his story, but not the sum of his worth. Claire was discovering that Marcus was exactly the kind of person she'd hoped existed, but had stopped believing she'd find kind and genuine and devoted to his daughter in ways that showed character rather than weakness, successful in ways that had nothing to do with salary and everything to do with impact on young lives. "I almost didn't come over," Claire confessed, as their conversation deepened into the kind of honesty that felt both scary and necessary. "Thought you'd think I was crazy for approaching a stranger, or that you'd assume I was pitying you and reject the gesture. Thought maybe I should mind my own business and let you process your terrible date alone. But I couldn't watch you sit here alone after she was so cruel. Couldn't ignore what I'd witnessed and pretend I hadn't seen someone be treated unfairly. Couldn't let you think that her assessment was accurate when it was so clearly wrong." "I'm glad you did," Marcus said. The words simple but weighted with gratitude and relief, and the beginning of hope that maybe tonight wasn't a complete disaster. Maybe something good could come from something terrible. Maybe Vanessa's cruelty had created space for Claire's kindness in ways that wouldn't have happened otherwise. I was sitting here thinking that she was right, that being a widowed single father made me undateable, that no one would want someone with my complications. And then you walked over and asked about Riley like my daughter was something to celebrate rather than baggage to tolerate, and that changed everything. At 8:30 p.m., 45 minutes after Claire had sat down uninvited at Marcus's table and transformed his worst night into something unexpected, the conversation shifted from careful getting-to-know-you questions into territory that felt raw and honest and necessary, the kind of conversation that usually happened months into knowing someone, but somehow felt right in this moment after they'd both admitted to being wounded by people who should have treated them better. "I thought I was undateable," Marcus confessed, the words tumbling out with the weight of 3 years of believing them. "Thought that being a widower with a kid and a teacher's salary meant no woman would want me. That those 3 things added up to someone too complicated and too poor and too damaged for anyone to choose when they could have someone simpler. Vanessa made that clear tonight," Marcus continued, voice rough with hurt that was still fresh, "made it very clear that I had too much baggage for her to consider, that my daughter was a complication she wasn't interested in dealing with, that my job wasn't impressive enough and my income wasn't sufficient and my grief made me unsuitable for dating." She said all of that in 15 minutes, managed to catalog every reason why I wasn't worth her time. And the terrible thing is that part of me believed her because I'd already been thinking those things myself for 3 years. Claire felt anger flash through her, hot and protective. Anger at Vanessa for her cruelty, and anger at a world that taught people to see love and devotion and resilience as burdens rather than strengths. Anger that this good man sitting across from her had internalized such terrible assessment of his own worth. "You're not baggage," Claire said fiercely, leaning forward with intensity that made Marcus meet her eyes. "You're a father who loves his daughter enough to make butterflies with her on a Friday afternoon, even though you're exhausted from teaching all week, who wears her glitter in your hair like a badge of honor, who chose to stay home with her instead of pursuing higher-paying career because being present for her mattered more than earning more money. You're a teacher who shapes young lives," Claire continued, voice strong with conviction, "who spends your days giving children the attention and patience and encouragement they need to believe in themselves, who probably changes lives in ways you'll never fully know, because that's what good teachers do. They plant seeds that grow long after students leave their classrooms. You're a man who survived loss that would have destroyed weaker people, who got up every morning for 3 years and took care of a toddler while grieving a wife, who learned to be both mother and father because your daughter needed you to be, who kept going when giving up would have been easier." "That's not baggage," Claire finished. "That's strength, that's character, that's evidence of a heart capable of profound love and commitment and resilience. And any woman who can't see that isn't worth your time, or your tears, or one more minute of you believing her assessment over your own truth." Marcus felt tears prick his eyes, felt emotion rising in his throat that made it hard to speak, felt something crack open in his chest that had been locked tight for 3 years. Nobody had said that before. Nobody had taken his circumstances and reframed them as strengths rather than weaknesses. Nobody had looked at his life and seen success instead of failure. Everyone saw burden when they looked at him, saw complications and limitations and reasons to keep distance, saw a widower who was still grieving, and a single father who came with a child, and a teacher who couldn't afford expensive dates, saw someone who required more effort than they were willing to invest. But Claire was seeing strength, was looking at the same circumstances that everyone else used as reasons to reject him, and seeing them as evidence of who he was at his core, was reframing his devotion to Riley and his commitment to teaching and his survival of grief as qualities that made him valuable rather than damaged. The tears that had been threatening spilled over, ran down Marcus's face in tracks he didn't bother to hide, because Claire had just seen him more clearly in 45 minutes than anyone had seen him in 3 years, had looked past his circumstances to who he actually was, and had decided that person was worth knowing. "I can't have children," Claire said quietly, matching his vulnerability with her own, revealing the wound that she'd been carrying since her marriage had fallen apart. Medical condition that we discovered about 5 years into our marriage. Some scarring from an infection I didn't know I had. Makes pregnancy essentially impossible without interventions we couldn't afford, and I wasn't willing to pursue. That was one of the reasons my ex-husband left, Claire continued, voice steady, despite the pain the admission cost her. Said he'd married me expecting to have a family, and I'd failed to provide that. Said I was defective in ways that made our marriage pointless. Said he wanted children more than he wanted me, and I'd taken that possibility away from him. So when you talk about Riley, when your whole face lights up discussing craft projects and kindergarten graduation and the million small moments that make up your life with her, I hear love, not burden. I hear devotion, not baggage. I hear a father who has what I've always wanted and never got to have. They sat in silence for a moment, both processing the admissions they just made, both recognizing that they'd been wounded differently but wounded nonetheless, both carrying pain that other people had inflicted through judgment and cruelty, and the particular damage that came from being told you weren't enough. Both judged unfairly by people who should have treated them better, Marcus for having a child and modest income, and grief he was still processing. Claire for not being able to have children and having a career that threatened her husband's ego, and choosing professional success over traditional domesticity. Both finding acceptance in this unlikely conversation with a stranger who'd become something more than stranger in the span of an hour. Finding someone who saw their wounds and didn't run, who heard their stories and responded with compassion rather than judgment, who understood that being damaged didn't mean being broken beyond repair. Connection was forming between them, not the superficial connection of first dates where everyone presented their best selves, but genuine connection built on honesty and vulnerability, and the recognition that they'd both survived things that had tried to destroy them. "Can I see you again?" Claire asked, the question carrying more weight than casual date request, because she was asking if he'd let her into his life, despite the complications. If he'd trust her with Riley, despite his fear of introducing his daughter to someone who might leave. If he'd give this connection the chance to become something more than one evening of unexpected kindness. "Really?" Marcus asked, voice carrying disbelief because he'd been rejected 90 minutes ago. And now a beautiful woman who'd witnessed his humiliation was asking to see him again. Was choosing him despite knowing everything that Vanessa had used as reasons to leave. "Really?" Claire confirmed, leaning forward with a smile that was nervous and hopeful simultaneously. "Maybe I could meet Riley. Maybe we could do something simple like a park or a craft project or whatever 5-year-olds do on Saturday afternoons. Maybe we could see if this connection we found over terrible coffee in a modest cafe is something that extends beyond one evening of commiserating about our terrible experiences with relationships." Marcus was scared in ways that made his heart race and his palms sweat because introducing Claire to Riley meant risking not just his own heart but his daughter's, meant potentially bringing someone into Riley's life who might leave and cause the kind of pain he'd been protecting her from for 3 years. But he was also hopeful in ways he hadn't been since Jordan died. Hopeful that maybe he'd found someone who saw his life with Riley as enhancement rather than complication, who understood that being a single father wasn't baggage but evidence of his capacity for love, who wanted to be part of their small family of 2 instead of requiring him to make himself smaller to fit into her life. "I'd like that," Marcus said, the words simple but weighted with the decision to be brave despite fear, to give this connection a chance despite the risk, to believe that maybe not everyone was like Vanessa, and maybe some people were worth the vulnerability. 2 weeks after that Friday evening at the cafe when Claire had walked over to Marcus's table and transformed his worst date into an unexpected connection, they met at the neighborhood park on a Saturday afternoon for the meeting that Marcus had been simultaneously anticipating and dreading. The introduction of Claire to Riley, the moment when his 5-year-old daughter would meet the woman who'd become important to him in ways he hadn't expected after just one evening of honest conversation. Riley was cautious when she first saw Claire, stayed close to Marcus's side with her small hand gripping his, assessed this new person with the careful evaluation that children use when adults enter their carefully constructed worlds, wasn't hostile, but wasn't immediately welcoming either, because she learned that people sometimes left and caution was safer than immediate attachment. Claire had brought art supplies in a canvas bag that she set on the park bench, pulled out construction paper and glitter and markers and pipe cleaners, the same materials that Marcus and Riley used for their Friday afternoon craft projects, Materials that said she'd been paying attention when Marcus talked about butterflies and purple everything, and the craft projects that left glitter everywhere. They bonded over crafts sitting on a blanket in the grass. Riley's caution melting as Claire showed her how to make paper flowers with petals that opened and closed, as Claire let Riley direct the project and praised her creativity and didn't mind when glitter ended up on both of them, as Claire proved through patience and genuine interest that she wasn't trying to replace Riley's mother, but was offering something new and valuable in its own right. "I like her, Daddy," Riley whispered to Marcus an hour later when Claire had walked to the water fountain, the declaration delivered with the seriousness of a 5-year-old making an important judgment. "She's nice, and she knows how to make the flowers right, and she doesn't get mad about glitter, and she listens when I talk about butterflies." Marcus felt his chest tighten with emotion. That was relief and hope, and the beginning of belief that maybe this could actually work, that maybe Claire could become part of their small family without causing the pain he'd been trying to protect Riley from. 1 month after that park meeting, Claire had become regular presence in their lives in ways that felt natural rather than forced. Was at their apartment 3 or 4 evenings a week, helping Riley with the pre-K homework that was mostly coloring and letter recognition, but that Riley took very seriously, was attending school events and sitting beside Marcus in tiny chairs designed for 5-year-olds while they watched Riley perform in the kindergarten readiness showcase. She helped with Riley in ways that went beyond babysitting, learned Riley's routines and preferences, and the particular way she needed to be comforted when she was sad, learned to braid hair through practice and patience, and Riley's gentle corrections when the braids weren't quite right. Marcus was falling in love, realized it one evening when Claire was reading Riley a bedtime story and doing all the voices, and Riley was giggling in ways she hadn't giggled since Jordan died. Realized he was watching them both with a kind of contentment he thought he'd never feel again after losing his wife. Realized that love didn't mean replacing what he'd had with Jordan, but meant building something new with Claire that honored the past while creating a future. Claire loved Riley like her own, felt the maternal instinct she thought was dead after learning she couldn't have biological children, discovered that loving someone else's child could fill the empty spaces in her heart in ways that were different from, but no less powerful than the biological connection she'd never have. 3 months after Claire and Marcus had started dating, after 3 months of building a relationship that included not just the two of them, but also Riley, who'd become the center of their growing family, Marcus took Claire to meet Jordan's parents with nervousness that made his hands shake and his stomach twist because their approval mattered in ways that went beyond normal meet-the-parents anxiety. Jordan's parents were the connection to his late wife, were Riley's grandparents who kept Jordan's memory alive through stories and photographs, and love that hadn't diminished despite 3 years of grief, and Marcus needed them to understand that loving Claire didn't mean forgetting Jordan, that moving forward didn't mean leaving the past behind. They loved Claire, saw in her the same qualities that Marcus had seen that first night in the cafe, saw her genuine affection for Riley and her respect for Jordan's memory, and her willingness to build family that honored what had been while creating what could be. Jordan would approve, Jordan's mother said with tears in her eyes and hands that gripped Claire's with gratitude and relief. She would want you to be happy, would want Riley to have a mother figure who loved her this completely, would want you both to live and not just survive. You both deserve happiness, Jordan's father added, deserve to build a family again, deserve to find love after loss, and we're grateful that Claire sees what we see, which is that you're both worth loving. 6 months after that Friday evening when Claire had walked over to Marcus's table uninvited, They returned to the same cafe and requested the same table by the window where everything had started, where Marcus had sat alone and humiliated and certain he was undateable, and where Claire had decided to act on impulse and change both their lives. Worst date led to best life, Marcus said as they sat down. Same table where Vanessa walked out and you walked over. Same place where I thought I'd confirm my worst fears and instead found someone who saw past my circumstances to who I actually was beneath the teacher's salary and the grief and the complications. Riley appeared from where she'd been hiding with the cafe owner who was in on the plan, appeared with a small box in her hands and glitter in her hair because some traditions were worth maintaining, walked over to Claire with the seriousness of a 6-year-old who understood she was participating in something important. "Will you be my mommy?" Riley asked, opening the box to reveal a ring that Marcus had chosen with Jordan's mother's help. A ring that came with Riley's blessing and Jordan's parents' approval and Marcus's hope that Claire would say yes to joining their family permanently. Claire was crying before Riley finished the question, was nodding yes through tears that meant joy and gratitude and the fulfillment of longing she'd carried for years to be someone's mother. 1 year after that proposal, they had a small wedding ceremony in the same park where Claire and Riley had first met, where they had bonded over construction paper flowers and glitter that had ended up everywhere, where Claire had proved that she was someone worth trusting with both Marcus's heart and his daughter's heart. Riley served as flower girl, wearing a purple dress she'd chosen herself and scattering rose petals with the concentration of a 6-year-old who understood her role was important. Walked down the aisle ahead of Claire and took her place beside Marcus where she belonged, because this wasn't just a wedding of 2 adults, but the formalization of a family that had been forming for a year. Jordan's parents attended with blessing that meant everything to Marcus, sat in the front row and cried happy tears and told Claire afterward that they were gaining a daughter, not losing a son, that loving Claire didn't mean Marcus was betraying Jordan's memory, but was honoring it by choosing to live fully again. Marcus said, "You saved me," during his vows, voice breaking with emotion as he looked at Claire and remembered the night she'd walked over to his table when he'd been at his lowest. "You saw me when I was invisible, valued me when I felt worthless, chose me when someone else had just rejected me. And you saved me from believing I was undateable." Claire replied, "We saved each other," because her own vows acknowledged that Marcus and Riley had given her the family she'd thought she'd never have, had shown her that biology wasn't the only path to motherhood, had proved that love built through choice and commitment was just as powerful as love created through blood. 2 years after the wedding, Claire had legally adopted Riley, who now carried both last names and called Claire Mommy. Without the hesitation that had marked the first few months, Claire was pregnant with their second child in a development that had shocked both of them, because doctors had said pregnancy was essentially impossible, but apparently miracles happened when you stopped desperately trying and simply lived. Marcus was still teaching 4th grade at Lincoln Elementary and loving it despite the modest salary. Claire was still consulting, but had reduced her travel to be more present for their family. They'd found balance that worked for them, even when it looked different from traditional models. Their family was complete in ways that had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with choice and commitment and the love that had grown from one act of kindness in a cafe 2 years ago. At the same cafe where everything had started, Marcus and Claire sat at their anniversary dinner at the same table by the window where Claire had asked if she could join him, and had changed both their lives, Riley with them in a booster seat because 6-year-olds were included in anniversary celebrations that honored the beginning of their family. "This is where Mommy Claire found us," Riley observed with a matter-of-fact tone of a child stating obvious truth. where she saw Daddy was sad and came over to make him happy, where our family started. Best blind date that wasn't, Marcus said, raising his coffee mug in a toast because this cafe didn't serve wine. But coffee was what they'd been drinking that first night anyway. Worst 15 minutes with Vanessa, followed by best evening with you. Humiliation that created space for connection. Rejection that led to the love that saved me. Best impulse I ever had, Claire replied, clinking her mug against his. Deciding to walk over instead of minding my own business, choosing to see your pain and address it instead of ignoring it. Acting on instinct that you were worth knowing despite having no evidence beyond glitter in your hair and quiet dignity during cruelty. They noticed a woman sitting alone 2 tables away, looking at her phone with the particular isolation of someone waiting for a date that was clearly late, watched as minutes ticked by, and her expression shifted from hopeful to worried to resigned. Recognized the body language of someone being stood up and the humiliation that came with public rejection. Claire looked at Marcus with raised eyebrow that was question, should we interrupt her loneliness the way Claire had interrupted Marcus's 2 years ago? Should they pay forward the kindness that had started everything? Definitely, Marcus confirmed, because they both understood now that small acts of courage could change lives. That approaching a stranger who was hurting was worth the risk of being rebuffed. That sometimes people needed to know they were seen even when they felt invisible. When Marcus Thompson sat alone after Vanessa walked out 15 minutes into their blind date, after she'd made cruel comments about teachers' salaries not being sufficient for someone who wanted to be taken seriously, and single dads with baggage being too complicated for women who had options, after she looked at the modest cafe he'd chosen because it was what he could afford, and asked with thinly veiled contempt if he couldn't afford somewhere nicer, after she'd cataloged every reason he wasn't worth her time, and had left him sitting there with glitter in his hair from his daughter's craft project and humiliation burning through him like fever. He thought this confirmed his worst fear that had haunted him for 3 years, that being a widowed father made him undateable in ways that no amount of devotion to his daughter or dedication to his teaching or survival of devastating loss could overcome. That no woman would want a man with a 5-year-old daughter who would always be his first priority in grief. He was still learning to carry like permanent weight in teacher salary that barely covered bills, much less expensive restaurants and fancy dates. But Claire Morrison, sitting 2 tables away and trying to focus on work presentation while actually watching this painful scene unfold, saw his quiet dignity during humiliation, saw how he remained polite even while being eviscerated, saw the glitter in his hair from afternoon crafts with his daughter, and understood immediately that this was a good father and a good man being treated cruelly by someone who couldn't recognize his worth, who measured value in salary and convenience rather than character and devotion. She walked over with her coffee mug in trembling hands and heart pounding with audacity of what she was about to do, and said, "I hate eating alone. Mind if I join you?" Words that would transform both their lives in ways neither could have predicted. Because sometimes the worst moments in our lives create space for the best connections. Sometimes the humiliation and rejection that feel like endings are actually beginnings in disguise. Sometimes the person who walks away reveals exactly who they are, while the person who stays reveals exactly who you needed all along. Sometimes kindness comes from strangers who witnessed your pain and couldn't ignore it. Strangers who become friends, who become family, who become the love story you didn't know you needed. Strangers who see past your circumstances to your character and choose to value what others dismissed as worthless. Sometimes the person who sees your worth is the one you least expect. Not the blind date who was supposed to be perfect, but the observer who saw you at your worst and decided you were worth approaching. Not the person your friends chose, but the person who chose you without prompting or pressure or promises of anything beyond one conversation. And sometimes the worst blind date, the 15 minutes of humiliation and rejection and confirmation of every fear you've been carrying about your own unworthiness, leads to the love story that saves you both, that gives you the family you thought you'd lost forever and gives her the family she thought she'd never have. That proves love isn't found in perfect circumstances, but in imperfect people choosing to see each other's value despite what the world says about their worth. If this story reminded you that the worst moments often lead to the best outcomes, that kindness towards strangers can change lives in ways you'll never predict, that being rejected by the wrong person creates space for the right person to find you, then you understand why stories like this need to reach people who are sitting alone right now, believing they're undateable, who've internalized cruel assessments of their worth, who need to know that someone will see their value even when they can't see it themselves, who are one act of kindness away from the connection that will transform their lives, but first need to believe that kindness still exists in strangers who become family. Have you ever had kindness from a stranger change your life? Ever been seen by someone when you felt invisible? Ever had your worst moment become the gateway to your best life? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and rate the story from 0 to 10, because your engagement helps us know that messages about unexpected kindness and choosing to see people's worth despite their circumstances matter enough to share with others who desperately need to hear them.